The Erishian Mountains. Part 1, on Erishians. It has been noted before that few of the tribal peoples of Erishian descent actually reside within the mountain range that bears their name. This is a common misconception, as the long history of the range and the conditions of the present day obscures the fact that said peoples are actually named for the range and not the other way around. This reason, though there are many others, forms the basis for the mistrust and dislike that the average man has for the Erishian. The history of the Erishian race at first glance would appear to be one totally of sorrow. Though many words have been written about the scale and cruelty of slavery that the Vladavina has subjected the Erishian race to, that system is only a measly 200 years compared to the thousands of years that the Erishian practice of slavery has existed. Even before this, at the height of Erishian civilization, if one could call it that, the Erishians or their ancestors were enslaved to the will of dark gods, whose nature remains lost to this day. Equally unknown is the extent of this bondage. Most generally agree that the gods exacted a bloody quota of sacrifices to be made daily in their name. Others have suggested, based on limited evidence, that the gods were present in the education and socialization of even the youngest children, and that the practices associated with this were unspeakable to say the least. The more superstitious have it that from even before the cradle, and even after death, one's soul and body remained in service or were devoured. It has even been proposed by some fulminant dominionists that their servitude to eldritch deities was what originally stained the skin of the Erishian dark as it is. These same elements go on to dictate that the Erishian has suffered in bondage to human masters for so long as penance, for his ancestors' worship of these things from beyond. Even if one were to take these beliefs as extreme, and dismiss them likewise, it is still something of a cruel irony that the Erishians would bear the name of a civilization that subjected their ancestors to such unimaginable horrors. Horrors that lurk yet still even today, millennia later. The Erishian civilization of ages long past has little evidence to examine. The insight we have been able to glean stems mostly from oral tradition, and only then from certain tribes. Curiously, the tribes with the most detailed records exist at the furthest possible distances from the mountain range. Much of our modern conception of the Erishian civilization is taken from stories passed to us by the Intihar Erishians who were conquered and enslaved by the Vladavina in its infancy. That is not to say that great efforts haven't been expended in pursuit of further knowledge. The Erishian Mountains, however, stubbornly retain their secrets. Expeditions into the range in the best of circumstances turned back early on, due to the spread of unusually virulent disease and premature food spoilage. Those that pressed further, such as that of the general Bezic the Magnificent, met a most ignoble end. For those that avoid immediate death, there are other such maladies as going mad in one's sleep that await them. Many expeditions have simply disappeared completely with no survivors, subsequent expeditions finding few remains and no bodies that might indicate what became of them. It goes without saying that these expeditions do not return with any substantial artifacts that allow us to glean further insight into the lost Erishian civilization. In this way, the Erishian finds himself a man without a history, without a country, often without freedom, and subsequently without direction. The more socially liberal of the Vladavina suggests that it is perhaps unsurprising that the Erishian takes most often to crime, or when he maintains an honest living, to wasting his wages on frivolous drinking and gambling. To further his misfortune, the only leaders and thinkers who have solutions in mind typically propose callous extermination or controlled breeding programs to eliminate this tendency. In at least one turn of good luck for the Erishian, these proposals remain unpopular for now. But as the sitting government and their allies fail to address the squalor and criminality of the Vladavina's mightiest cities, young minds that demand swift action have begun to consider that the ends may justify the means. If cooler heads do not prevail, the future will be one stained dark red with blood. Part 2, Nature of the Erishian Mountains. Human habitation of the mountains is virtually impossible, for reasons that are self-evident to even the most cursory reader. There is little that can be said of the mountain range that can match the reality of dread one may experience, if they should find themselves anywhere near it. Before their arrival, the hypothetical traveler would note that the ground cover and other plant life grows ever thinner and more sparse the closer they are to the mountains. What little hardy shrubs and roots remain, abruptly terminate somewhere around 10 miles into the range. The soil is composed mostly of sand. Despite the strong presence of what appears to be ash in the composition, the soil is not nourishing, and will typically kill anything planted in it. Up to and including tougher specimens such as grave wheat. The few conventional species that the Erishian Mountains call home typically exist at this range, known as the borderlands. Notably, there is a strong preponderance of carrion-eating species, despite the presence of little in the way of herbivores to sustain them. The razorbeak corvid nests primarily in rocky crags and crevices overlooking valleys. The spotted shortwolf, when not spending its time digging up corpses from graveyards to feast on, retreats up to this area to den and raise pups. It is speculated that the despised biting locust originates from the mountain range as well, though this has never been confirmed by natural philosophers. Beyond this point, little flora has been observed. There are no trees to speak of. Some expeditions have noted a curious plant that takes the form of a clump of small porous spikes jutting from the earth. Birds and small animals such as the stone rat have been seen impaled on these spikes. Tribes brave enough to venture into the mountains most often do so in order to gather the variety of tip leaf that grows only in that location. Its leaves are a greasy black color rather than the usual dark green, and its poison is orders of magnitude more potent. Unlike the regular tip leaf poison, the black variant will foul the meat of anything it kills, meaning it is typically used as a weapon of war rather than for hunting. Past a certain point, perhaps some 30 to 50 miles in, it is observed that nothing at all grows. Thus begins the dead ring. The blasted soil takes on a much higher percentage of gravel and loose stones, which often only serves to make the life of any expedition venturing into the range much more miserable. The color of the stones is usually said to be a taupe gray, but chalky white has also been observed in the north and far eastern parts of the range. This is of course the least of the dangers present. Sustained through some unknown means, horrors stalk this outer range. There are the common night gaunts, but stranger still are the wild six-legged cliff screechers that leap from above to devour their prey alive. A rare but frightening sight is the dreaded wormhound, a creature much larger than the short wolf, but altogether different from the common wolves that exist beyond the mountains. These creatures are infested with hundreds of tuberous, biting worms that can strip the flesh from a man's bones in a matter of minutes. The worms themselves are often a pestilence, having ruined whole villages from the passing of just one hound. Higher up still, so deep into the mountains that their locations can only be conjectured at, are the nests of the mighty Erishian mountain dragons. Terrible lizards so massive that their talons can grasp an elephant of the Far East, with a wingspan large and powerful enough that the creature can take flight with its quarry. Lone juveniles have at several points throughout history devastated entire cities with their acid breath and the winds caused by their passing. The existence of such tremendous creatures, in a range that otherwise holds no life, has been the subject of much speculation. The leading theory is that the residual energy left behind by the cataclysm that destroyed the Erishian civilization ages past sustains these bizarre and unreal creatures, similar to how demons sustain themselves. This has been challenged by some mystics, as divination of mountain dragon corpses has revealed little to no latent magic in their scales or flesh. For a time, the strongest challenger to this theory was the idea that deep within the mountains, there had to exist a sweet spot, an oasis of wilderness, so to speak, beyond the dead ring. This brings us to the tale of Bezic the Magnificent and his daring, if unwise, expedition. Part 3. Bezic the Magnificent. General Bezic Gorkov is acknowledged to be one of the greatest generals that the Vladavina has ever reared. The fourth son of his generation, and thus unlikely to ever inherit the ducal title of Krasina, Bezic was groomed from a young age to be an officer. At every turn he succeeded, eventually achieving the rank of colonel by the age of 21. While at first presumed to be the product of nepotism, Bezic quickly rose through the ranks to general during the First Acrasian War. Only a few short years later he single-handedly defeated several enemy armies during the Gorslavan War, earning the moniker, the Magnificent. It is perhaps unsurprising that with such incredible achievement came equally incredible ambition. Much of the fighting in the Gorslavan War took place in a lesser range to the south of the Erishian Mountains, against supernatural armies that were bolstered by the undead, and other horrors enslaved by the vampiric overlord of the tiny realm. Though the armies of the Vladavina suffered heavy casualties against these nightmares, Bezic's victories convinced him that, with steel and ingenuity, conventional forces could overcome the supernatural and win through. Using this reasoning, and his tremendous reputation within the military, Bezic commissioned the largest expedition into the Erishian Mountains ever recorded. Bezic would lead a full battalion of mounted troops, some 800 lancers, and 500 chain guards as heavy cavalry. Accompanying them would be a complement of 130 mystics of the Opiekun order, which at the time numbered a tenth of the order's martial strength. These troops had fought alongside Bezic during both wars, and were considered amongst the most decorated and experienced the Vladavina could muster. Bezic's plan was to travel deep into the mountains, fight his way past the Dead Ring and establish an outpost in the conjectural oasis wilderness he believed lay beyond. 1,000 auxiliaries would handle the supplies, with the understanding that forces could be broken off along strategic points to establish a baggage train through the mountains. The general was even optimistic enough to discuss the possibility that tribal peoples expected to be living in the oasis could be enslaved and used as labor to assist in the establishment of the forward post. Before his troops even reached the mountain range, misfortune had already befell the doomed expedition. A particularly nasty case of badwater flu took its toll on the troops. Some 200 men fell from the saddle, and Bezic himself lay bedridden with the disease for 2 weeks. Despite this setback, the general remained determined. He was able to replace some of his lost numbers with chain guards from local garrisons, though the communities could only spare around 40 men. Around this time, 20 of his eldest and most experienced mystics were suddenly recalled from the expedition without explanation. Still, the general pressed on, reaching the borderlands in the summer of the year 74 AE. Shortly after their arrival, the campsite of Bezic's expedition came under attack from an unknown Erishian tribe. Bezic reported that his men exterminated the Erishians who, quote, fought to the last, some of the women even fighting with babies on their backs. Bezic reported his casualties as light and pressed on, sending the wounded home with news of his progress. The Dead Ring was reached, and the first unit was detached to begin forming the series of outposts which would facilitate the baggage train that would be vital to the later part of the expedition. At this point, accounts of the expedition become fragmented and unclear. Bezic's logbook and those of his senior officers were never recovered, leaving only the accounts of his men to enlighten us. What all accounts agree upon is that roughly a week into the Dead Ring, after sustaining numerous attacks by screechers and poisonous needle tigers, Bezic's expedition encountered a series of narrow passes or chutes that blocked the way. On average, lines of 5 men could pass alongside each other, but further ahead, the chutes often narrowed to the point where 2 or even only 1 man on horseback could pass at a time. Attempts to circumvent these passes proved fruitless. Lacking other options, and refusing to turn back, Bezic made the fateful decision to divide up his men. It is believed that he reasoned the passes could not go on too long, though what he based this presumption on is left to guesswork. The chutes were some of the worst terrain yet, craggy, uneven, and oftentimes home to streams or small rivers of foul brackish water that sickened the men unfortunate enough to fall into them. Night gaunts would of course attack every witching hour, but the accounts of deserters often mention chute lurkers that would descend in the narrow passes and carry men off to an unknown fate. When the expedition was not engaged in combat, it was still often plagued by odd encounters. One such note describes the mostly complete skeleton of a whale, hundreds of miles inland, with no marks or damage to the bones to suggest it was carried there by a dragon or other large predator. Scouts would often report one of the passes ahead of Bezic's retinue opening up into a path of slick black stones that would inexplicably no longer be there by the time the bulk of the party made its way to the location. Bezic would often execute his scouts personally upon this revelation. It is undetermined precisely how many casualties the expedition suffered throughout this grueling march, but scholars speculate that it had to be at least half, if not 3/4. The only indication that the expedition made it beyond the chutes to elsewhere comes from the notes of a dead chain guard whose body was recovered decades later. The corpse had been wandering around in an undead state in the plains, some 30 miles outside the borderlands. The notes were unfortunately vague, lacking any description of the area beyond the chutes other than to note that it was a vast mighty space of presumably open ground. There is nothing in the account to indicate the presence of trees, flora, or anything else denoting the wilderness that Bezic had hoped to find at the beginning of the expedition. The account does contain the only known description of a mountain dragon nest, said to be cyclopean, and surrounded by hundreds of skeletons of unknown creatures. Most of the account deals with descriptions of the men, who by this point in the expedition were badly undernourished and suffering from disease. Many of the afflicted men were coughing up black blood and could not sleep due to intense nightmares that upon waking they could not recall. Bezic himself was described as having the appearance of an old man, with crazed eyes, and a growling voice that was barely intelligible to his troops. Whatever claimed the life of this soldier evidently came upon him so swiftly that it was not recorded. The accounts of the expedition not given by the returned wounded were found by the smaller rescue expeditions dispatched a year later, in 75 AE. These rescue teams never found any men alive, usually only their ruined campsites lacking even bodies to identify. Other than the initial wounded sent home during the summer of 74, none of the 2,500 or so members of Bezic the Magnificent's expedition returned home to the Vladavina alive. Only the single aforementioned undead specimen was recovered in the year 104 AE by hunters. No others are known to have risen. Legend has it that the surviving members who avoided their fate all met with unfortunate or mysterious ends in the years following the disappearance of the expedition. Though some examples have been recorded of untimely deaths, it is impossible to confirm these reports as the Red Flu Plague and its resulting chaos took hold in 75 AE. Record-keeping in the Vladavina, especially at its fringes around the mountains, would suffer well until the mid-80s when the plague finally burnt out. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe for more.